All right, well, my clock just struck noon, and so I am thrilled to formally welcome all of you to our conversation at Graham, looking back on the first fascist century with David Gutherz, who is a partner here in our efforts at Graham as an instructor of a course with a similar name that is upcoming this autumn. Let me just welcome you all. I'm the Dean of the Graham School, and I'm thrilled before we get started on our conversation to just give you a little introduction to the University of Chicago. You can see our beautiful campus. It's always glorious in spring at the university. And this is just, in short, a place where big ideas that change and challenge the world are born. As a new dean here, I have to say I have been in awe of my colleagues, of the faculty and their field-defining research, and of the ways in which we are bringing that research to the world. And that is where Graham's mission comes in. Since the founding of the university, we are actually the first liberal arts extension in the entire United States. We have been part of the University of Chicago, and our role is to be a pioneer in bringing the ideas of this great university to the world and ensuring that people can access them and be part of the rigorous intellectual environment here throughout their lives. And so we are here for people at all ages and stages and from all academic and vocational backgrounds who want to be part of a learning liberal arts community. One of the things that really distinguishes us is our rigor. And so we explore big ideas that change and challenge the world, and we invite deep inquiry, and we lean into the hard questions. And we pursue all of it in the spirit that when we have open exchange, we all come out as greater learners. And today is a great example of that. We're going to be exploring really topical and very important issues in a way that is open, and we'll be hearing your questions toward the end of our discussion. Let me just mention that this is one element of what we do, meaning there's open courses, and so you'll have a preview of one today. We also have a Master of Liberal Arts that is among the most respected and rigorous in the entire world. We have a basic program that is totally unique in its 4-year commitment to the great books that are at the corner and core of Western canon. And then we have a set of annual programs that allow you to do everything from look at museum publishing all the way over to civics here in Chicago. Let me just also mention, for those of you who enjoy these programs and want to continue your learning outside of the formal classes, that we have many more opportunities for you to dip into our work here at Graham over the next month. And you see them up on your screen. In a moment, I'll put in the chat an opportunity for those interested to learn more about these 4 upcoming events and where you can RSVP for free to the opportunities to everything from, diving into Shakespeare to looking at the future of work to looking at one of the great poets of our time. But today you are here for a very specific reason. You're here to learn from David, and I just want to give the shortest of biographies because we are eager to spend most of our time in conversation with him. David has a philosophy of religion bachelor's from Oberlin, and then went on to get his master's and PhD at the Committee on Social Thought here at the University of Chicago. He has a book underway called The Great Unbinding that's going to be looking at fascism in Italy. And he is also a teaching fellow in the social sciences. And most interesting to us as a school that's all about lifelong learning, he has already begun bringing his incredible thought leadership into the public sphere through his work as an editorial consultant at Invisibilia, which is an award-winning NPR show, as well as a contributor to All Things Considered and a number of other programs. And so with that, I am going to remove this screen, and I'm going to allow you all to see David as we enter our conversation with him. And let me just start by saying that this is intended as a preview discussion. So we're very excited to raise a lot of big topics here we're going to be inevitably trying to cover 100 years and the history and responses to fascism, unable to get to everything, but our goal is to kind of give a taste of what's to come in the course that you'll be teaching with us this autumn. And so maybe just to set the table, David, I can start by asking you to give us a snapshot of this first fascist century. And I know that's a very dangerous question to ask to an intellectual historian who studies this and is writing his PhD on one aspect of this, but can you give us the 3 to 5 minute kind of overview of the totality of this first fascist century? And then we're going to dig into different pieces of it.
Sure. First, I just want to make sure everyone can hear me clearly. I saw there was a note in the chat that maybe I wasn't speaking up enough. So just Seth, I know you'll be watching there to make sure, but I'm coming through clearly to you, yes?
Yes, I hear you great. And yeah, if I'm unsatisfied, it has nothing to do with the ability to hear you, just a little humor.
Yeah, I can deal with the other forms of dissatisfaction. First, let me just say, thank you so much for having me. I'm really just delighted and honored to have this opportunity to have this conversation that, as you said, is just a kind of first entry into some of the issues that we'll be exploring in the course over the next, beginning in the fall of this year. So, with that in mind, everything I say is kind of provisional, best I can do in 3 to 5 minutes. And if you want to learn more, just come to the course and we can argue it all out together. But to speak to your specific question, this idea of the first fascist century, I think it's helpful to start off by just saying, this phrase fascist century comes to us from Benito Mussolini. In 1932, Mussolini and his sort of pet philosopher, Giovanni Gentile, a Hegelian thinker, wrote an essay in which they argued that the 19th century had been the century of socialism and liberalism, that the debates over socialism and liberalism had defined that century. And so the 20th century, they said, was going to be about authority and about the state, and therefore that it would be a fascist century. So that's their use of the term fascist century. Now, for me, when I sort of take on this term, what I'm thinking about is, if we take the idea of the fascist century, not in this ideologically loaded way, but as a historian, thinking about the century that passed from 1922 when Mussolini took power to today, the question is, can we use this grid of fascism versus anti-fascism, or authoritarianism versus anti-authoritarianism, to understand the major movements in that century, rather than say the sort of classical ways of talking about it during the Cold War, about communism versus capitalism or secularism versus liberalism. And I guess what I would say, if you put on those goggles, if you put on the sort of fascist century goggles, what you see is kind of 3 movements. During the first third of the fascist century, it really clearly looks like fascism is the wave of the future, is the vanguard, as they claimed to be. Just some easy statistics about this. In 1920, coming out of World War I, there are maybe 36 officially liberal constitutional states out of the sort of 60 or so that were recognized, many of them having sort of colonial or subcolonial populations that couldn't take part in the process, but officially liberal states in 35 in the post-war period. By 1938, that number had been halved to 17. Okay, 17 states, and then down to 12 by 1941, which is sort of the apex of fascist power, global power. And then, of course, the next period that we traditionally talk about is the Cold War. Through this lens, it looks more like a kind of golden age of anti-fascism, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. Though it's worth noting that the officially anti-fascist regimes of the Soviet Union and the United States were competing with one another to sort of prop up authoritarian populist regimes all over the Southern Hemisphere. And then in the last 20 to 30 years, what we start to see then is a kind of boomerang effect, where neo-fascist movements are whipping up anger and hatred by stigmatizing immigrants who are coming in from the global South into the global North, often fleeing from societies that had been destroyed, had been wrecked, that had been torn apart by these sort of authoritarian populist regimes that were set up by these these officially anti-fascist global powers. And I think that's why I'm really excited to have this conversation here, because we really need to have that sort of longer historical lens and the global lens to understand the sort of domestic shifts that we're talking about here in the United States and across Europe as well, in terms of the reconsolidation of these neo-fascist movements. I think I'll maybe stop there. Hopefully that's the kind of stuff that we were hoping.
You know, it's a really helpful snapshot. And I think the story that you're portraying in my own imagination is almost like a roller coaster, and you can kind of see it coming up and down, and the numbers reflect that. And it's also a transformational roller coaster in that the actual look of fascism is obviously very different in, you know, the 21st century than it was, you know, in the 20th. And so, you know, I want to kind of now begin to bite off pieces of this, because you mentioned three waves. And so maybe we can go back to the start and, you know, that first wave, and in particular, the origin story of fascism in Italy. Where did that movement originally come from? You mentioned, you know, 1922. So bring us back there. You know, where does this whole idea of fascism emerge?
Yeah, great question. I think it's helpful. I think it's helpful to actually sort of separate out two aspects of that question. The larger question of where does the idea of fascism emerge is it's maybe a little big. Maybe we can return to it in pieces as we go. You know, but if in terms of the origin story of Italian fascism, it's important to start by saying, you know, we need to debunk a misconception that is promoted by the fascists' own origin story. So the Italian fascists always claimed that they had come to power through this march on Rome, which for them was a revolutionary coup. And they were these consummate outsiders who had, you know, were draining the swamp and kicked out the sort of corrupt elites. And that is just not true. You know, the fascists in Italy and in Germany and in Japan, they were invited into power. They were invited into power by traditional elites. No real fascist movement has ever come to power through a military coup, though many have come to power, obviously, through military invasions. But in Italy's case, you know, Mussolini was essentially invited to come into power through this parade, this sort of like farce of a march by the traditional elites, liberal and conservative, who thought that they could co-opt him for their own purposes. Now, the question then becomes, well, why did Mussolini seem useful, right? Why did the fascists seem useful? Because if you look at fascism when it comes out of World War I, which is really what it comes out of, it is not a movement that seems like it's very friendly to the status quo. You know, you have this kind of loose, these squads of like anarchists, syndicalists, ex-socialists like Mussolini, supranationalists, and disgruntled veterans who formed the core of fascism at its founding in 1919. And that movement, what is sometimes called the fascism of San Sepolcro, in reference to the area in Milan where the fascist party was founded, they're really not united by much of anything aside from a kind of anger at the prosecution of World War I and the settlement, what they call the mutilated victory of World War I, and this belief in what Mussolini at that time calls trenchocracy. That is to say, the idea that the people who fought the war, the sort of military elite, the warrior class, ought to be running the country. And they had no love for the people who were running the country at that time and were very aggressive towards the ruling powers. But at the same time, the real threat to the status quo in Italy in 1919, 1920, when fascism is founded, is coming from the left. It's coming from the socialist movement. There are, you know, workers and peasants in the streets, in the factories, in the fields, who are demanding more control over their lives, who are demanding shorter hours, who are saying, you know, noi faremo come la Russia, we're going to make like in Russia, we're going to make a revolution. And this kind of scares the elites, the ruling class, a great deal, probably out of proportion to the real threat. And it's then that these fascist paramilitary groups are brought in to crush this kind of nascent revolution. They kill, between 1920 and 1922, some 2,000 people in street fights. There are hundreds of socialist headquarters are burnt, trashed. Journalists have castor oil poured down their throats just for reporting on what was happening. And so it's at this moment then, in 1921-22, that Mussolini starts to look like a power broker who can somehow actually stop the violence that he himself is inciting, right? That he's going to come in and shut down these squads and shut down the street fighting and save Italy from the Bolshevik revolution. And it's worth saying, I know I've gone on too long, so this is the last point I'll make here, is that that was the way that he was seen by world leaders for the first decade of his power there, including FDR, including Churchill, many liberals in the United States. They saw Mussolini as the savior of Italy, who had stopped the red flood of communism from washing across Europe, and that was really how the fascist movement comes into power.
Well, so, as we think about fascism, I'm curious to begin distinguishing it because, there have been a lot of reactionary movements. And so, no shortage of them. And so, what you described in this example, of, this reaction that's taking place after World War One, you can kind of see how that leads to the roots of this new moment. But maybe we can take a little bit of time and say what distinguishes fascism, what makes that moment different, for example, from all the other reactionary movements that have come before. I think of the French Revolution or the this or the that, where, aspects of that story feel to me as a non-trained historian, similar. And so I'm just curious, how do we begin distinguishing what's happening here that is unique and that is carrying through, thematically as we look forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is really one of the central questions in the field of the history of fascism. And for those of you who are signed up for the course or want to sign up for the course, we're going to be looking at this question about the specificity of fascism basically every week. And it matters, right? Because it's not just an academic debate. If you want to fight against fascism, you need to understand what it is in specific, right? You need to know how to target it, as it were, what distinguishes it from other kindred phenomenon. And there are lots of historiographical debates about exactly how we ought to do this. My own approach is inspired by the historian Robert Paxton, who argues that we ought to look at the sort of what he calls the mobilizing passions of fascism. So not only at what the fascists say that they're about, which can often be quite misleading, but what seems to drive people. So it's a mix of sort of cultural and sociological analysis of fascist movements in process. And Paxton, we'll read some of his essays. He identifies somewhere between like 9 and 13 mobilizing passions, which we're not going to go into here, obviously. I'm not going to give you a 13-point list. But I think we can talk about 3 that are really helpful in distinguishing in this particular question about distinguishing between other kinds of reactionary regimes. Number 1, this is one that's really hard to wrap our heads around. The fascists were Democrats of a sort. That is to say, they were committed in a way that the previous dictatorships and reactionary regimes and competing reactionary regimes were not, to the idea that the state was the expression of the power of the people and the interpreter of the people. And that's why you see all of these, we associate fascism with these mass rallies, with people goose-stepping and doing gymnastics and things like this, is because the fascists thought that these mass assemblies were a more realistic representation of the will of the people than the sort of isolated individuals voting in booths or, the marketplace of ideas, which is an idea that also dates from this period. And of course, they didn't believe that everybody counted as part of the people, right? They didn't believe, so many fascists thought many Jews, gypsies, differently abled people didn't count as part of the people. But if you think of this in terms of the democracy at that time in the 1920s, that's not at all exceptional, right? In the United States, we didn't count all the people as part of the people. So that's the first point, is they're kind of anti-liberal Democrats. The second point is that unlike prior nationalists, there is a kind of supranationalism that inspires these fascists. And the way I kind of think about, you use the word reactionary, right? Which we think of as like someone who wants to roll back certain kinds of gains that were made by certain liberal or progressive movements. The fascists, that's not exactly what they were up to. They weren't just trying to like go back to the good old days, although they sometimes said that they were. They set themselves against the historical process as such. They didn't accept the idea that we should submit to history, to progress, right? And so while they are modernizers and modernists, they're interested in sort of like technologically updating their country, a core idea of fascism is this kind of what's called sometimes palingenetic nationalism. That is to say, they would resurrect this nation that had been killed during World War I and by treacherous Jews or communists or what have you, and they would jump into the future by reaching back towards myth, reaching into this mythic dimension. That's a core aspect of the fascist ideal that is hard to identify in other places. And the third thing I'll say just briefly is a kind of commitment to a sexual militancy, which has two sides to it. On the one hand, a kind of biologization of the political, the idea that certain sexual acts, sex between people, but also the raising of children, care for one another, the structure of the family, that these were part of a battle that the nation was running. And this is something that traditional religious conservatives at that time were really against, and ended up turning a lot of them against the fascist movement, was this biologization. And the flip side of that coin is this erotic attachment to the masculine military body, this cult of the young soldier as the vanguard of the people that's going to save the nation and resurrect it against all of these forces that are trying to destroy it. So those, I think, are three ways in which we can distinguish fascism from, on the one hand, classical dictatorship, on another hand, a sort of traditional religious conservatism, and on the third hand, from a sort of standard nationalism.
Well, so I just want to let everyone know we're going to be taking your questions shortly. So if you want to start chatting them in, I'll begin looking at them. I've got two more for David before we get to those. Let me begin pivoting. I mean, and there's a lot more to say, obviously, about fascism and its growth in Germany and Japan that follows, and then all the way to today. But your course is not just about fascism. It's also about anti-fascism, because this last century has featured an abundance of movements and initiatives to try to address and root out fascism. And so I'm curious, just to kind of, skip ahead in this story a bit, what do you see as some of the most compelling examples of efforts to address fascism? So you kind of named there these three elements that are foremost in your mind, but I'm curious now to begin looking at the other side of, okay, so you can imagine how, in some ways, compelling those three elements can be in certain moments in countries' lives. How do you begin to address this, and what are some of the most compelling examples that you see over these last 100 years?
Yeah, this is something that I wake up every day thinking about, for better or worse. And I'm looking forward to the opportunity to discuss this with the students in the class, because I would say my answer tends to change week by week, as the history changes. But I'd say two things. One, I think we're in a moment where we really have to question the classical strategies employed by the anti-fascist states that was oriented towards a kind of like name and shame approach to fascism. That is to say, call out the fact that fascists had committed a set of crimes, which of course they had, right? And show the world that they were on the wrong side of history, which seemed, I think, if you would ask me 10 years ago, that seemed to be a pretty good strategy. The problem is, as you'll recall, right, that fascists see themselves as on the wrong side of history, right? That's not news to them. and you're setting yourself up for a situation in which everybody who is upset at how history is going and who feels that they're on the downside, on the wrong side of history, those people then become sort of ripe for fascist propaganda, and you're not in a good position to interrupt that propaganda for fascist radicalization, right? So that's a problem. And one that we need to wrestle with. It's not an easy thing to just toss out, because obviously it's meant a great deal to many people to have this kind of Holocaust commemoration and focus on the war crimes that the fascists committed in Manchuria, in Libya, etc. So you don't want to take those away. But I think that the way to focus in on them is, focusing in on this aspect of militarism. In the 60s and the 70s, there was a clear association between fascism and militarism. And there was a strong anti-militarist movement. And one of the most popular books in the post-war period in Japan is a book of memoirs of soldiers who were sent to fight by the fascist regime and who were talking about how horrible it was, how much they didn't want to do it, how painful it was, all the little indignities of war, just bursting the myth of this war experience, this romance of the great soldier. And I think that, if we were to reach back into the moment of these grassroots anti-militarist pacifist movements, I think we could really find some models today for ways to address emerging fascist or neo-fascist movements.
So I have one more question, and then we have a number in the chat that I promise I'm going to get to very soon. Why does an understanding of the history of fascism and anti-fascism matter? And I asked that, and you kind of referenced it earlier, because I think that in some ways you could just say, "Oh, this is a name," or "This is," and so how do you think about for people that are wondering if they should go deeper in learning about this subject? How do you think about the why behind understanding these distinctions and why this history of both fascism and anti-fascism are important to citizens?
Sure. It's a great question. I guess I'd say two things. I mean, the first is, as I've been trying to stress throughout this sort of conversation, the history of anti-fascism matters in terms of how we approach fascism, right? So, when I teach classes on fascism, one of the things that really blew my mind was a lot of my students, this association between militarism and sex and fascism was just not on their minds. It wasn't there for them. And that's a problem, in a time when the white nationalists are infiltrating the military in the United States, right? There's something like 1/3 of members of the army in the United States have reported seeing white nationalist activity inside of the military, right? So that we need to talk about militarism if we're going to confront that. So that's one thing is, we have to, sometimes things get lost in the history of fascism as interpretations of fascism become dominant, and we need to return continuously to the history of fascism in order to understand what the challenges that we face today. But the second point I'd make is, my course is called How to Cure a Nazi. And, there's something tongue in cheek about that. But part of the point is to say, physician, heal thyself, right? That fascism, as we've identified it here, is not only something that's out there, that's the bad people, that is, threats from explicit white nationalism. It's also about turning the frame onto ourselves and asking ourselves, how are we exposed to authoritarian ideas? What kicks us into authoritarian mode? What makes us reach for things that have, for fascist solutions to social problems? I deeply believe that part of the challenge is for us to study the history of fascism in order to sort of like get at the little fascist inside our heads, as Wilhelm Reich called it. And so I think for those two reasons, putting aside the whole historical conjuncture that we're looking at right now in terms of the rise of a reactionary, potentially, authoritarian populist right, those two things remain for me part of the core reason why we ought to have these discussions together to try and get at, the fascism inside and the fascism outside.
Well, so we have many people that want to dig in further to this discussion with you. And I'm going to start with a question from Tom Iapolo, who asked, to what extent were the fascists motivated by a criticism of capitalism, its wealth inequalities, and exploitation of workers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's tricky, we know, when we talk about motivations, right? It's very hard. I think as a historian, it's one of the hardest questions we wrestle with is how do you figure out, what someone's motivations are? Because many fascists claimed to be critical of capitalism. They talked about wanting to see a third way between capitalism and communism. This was a standard part of fascist propaganda. And here in the United States, the people who were looking at Mussolini's Italy and sympathetically, we're talking about it as a place where the machine has a soul, right? So it was kind of a friendlier capitalism, a capitalism that was getting rid of class struggle. Now, I think the facts tell a different story. If you look at the economies that they ran, they didn't really touch private property. They certainly didn't do anything of the Nazis or the fascists to address inequality in their countries. And so if they were trying to, fight against the worst ills of capitalism, I think we could say that is something that they, sort of hopelessly failed at. And in Italy in particular, there's this constant attempt to produce this kind of corporativist vision in which the state would be the prime mediator between labor and capital. And it always really fell apart. And when it was working, it always fell on the side of capital. So that's a short answer to a very, very complicated question. Adam Tooze's work, The Wages of Destruction, is an excellent economic history of Nazi Germany. And there's a number less good work done on Italy. Where the work on Italy is usually there's a lot less of it, but there's a lot out there. I'm happy to recommend if you're interested in that topic.
So, David, we have a few questions around, does this qualify as fascism in your view? And maybe I'll pair two, even though they're entirely separate in type, but just to get these on the table in terms of this whole definitional question that is at the core of this discussion. One comes from David. I'm sorry, one is to you, David. It comes from Ray Jones. It's, would you consider Franco's Spain as a fascist state? And then Glenn Miller asked a very present question here in the US. Do you feel that current American groups such as the Proud Boys fall within the definition of fascism? So again, two very different examples, but they're both calling out for this, definitional question. Sure. So I pair them for that reason.
Sure. I've had many debates about Spain. I think that the place I land is that Spain was a more traditional authoritarian dictatorship. Franco is, allied with the church and doesn't have the same kind of, that emphasis that we put on the kind of the democratic impulses of fascism, the idea that the mobilization of the masses is essential to fascist legitimation, is harder for me to see in Spain, though it's a kind of mixed thing because Franco himself had to play up his ties with the Falange, which is a Spanish fascist organization, genuinely fascist organization, during that first third of the fascist century in order to show himself as being part of the vanguard, right? So Franco himself tried to make himself appear more fascist than he was. And I think, a historian of Spain could give you a more detailed answer about the way that this changed over the long duration of Franco's rule. In terms of the Proud Boys, I have to plead that I don't know enough about the Proud Boys' social vision, their vision of the state, to be able to really give a solid answer to that question. I think that we can definitely see that sexual militancy that we were talking about before as part of the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys. And we can certainly see a kind of rabid racist biological thinking that is part of the fascist legacy. And but I don't know if we can, I don't know enough about their vision of what the state should look like. And for fascism, it is always about everything within the state, nothing outside the state. The state is the molder of human beings. And so that's what would stop me short from saying, yes, we can definitely identify the Proud Boys as a fascist organization, though they seem to me to be in the lineage, at least, of a set of what I referred to using the Japanese philosopher of fascism, Miramaro Masao's idea of grassroots fascism, a fascism from below. I think you can see some elements there. That's a different type of definitional question than when you talk about a fascist regime, as in talking about Franco's Spain. Does that answer those questions? I know that it's,
Yes.
it feels sometimes like splitting hairs and you're like these ingredients and that ingredients. Whether something is fascist or not doesn't mean it's bad or not, right? That's not the question. The question is, how do we position it within this historical lineage in order to understand how to undermine it if that's what you're interested in doing?
Well, so we have questions from Mary Watson and W. Olson that relate to fascism in the US. So continuing, I guess, on that last point. One from Mary is, what were the fascist trends in the US in the 30s, 40s, and 50s compared to any seen today? And then a related question in my mind is, are you able to identify extensions of fascism to parts of the US, for example, the Congress or even bureaucracies? And so, both relating to this question of where, even though it hasn't come necessarily to full power, where do we see extensions or connections to this movement within the United States?
Yeah, tough questions. You're putting me on the spot here. But let's take them in turn, right? So the first question, if I understand it correctly, is how do we identify the fascist currents in United States history in that first phase of the fascist century? Is that right?
Perfect.
Yeah. So what I would say is it's a story of a kind of just barely missed meeting between grassroots and top-down fascists. So on the one hand, I think Paxton, the historian I referenced before, talks about the Ku Klux Klan as one of the most fully formed sort of grassroots fascist movements, which is refounded, right? Importantly, the second Klan, not the first Klan, but the second Klan that's refounded in the 20s, as having a lot of the core constituents of fascism. And of course, we know, the Birth of a Nation was shown in the White House, right? So it's not exactly a movement that doesn't have access to the elite power. And there were many people in FDR's White House and inner circle who urged him to respond to the Great Depression by reaching for the solutions that the Italians had found during the first decade of fascist rule. And it's a really interesting story as to why that isn't how it went down. There's a great historian, Ira Katzenelson, who's got a book, I think it's titled Fear Itself, that kind of tells the story. But essentially, it was the white Southern Democrats who stopped fascism, the FDR's movement from going sort of full fascist. We forget in the For Freedom speech, FDR said, if Congress won't do what I want it to do, I may have to declare an emergency decree to do it myself, to declare himself to be essentially a dictator, as Hitler would do shortly afterwards. And he didn't end up doing that because Congress was able to act. So that's what I mean by this sort of misalliance, this sort of missed pass, or this almost miss in American fascism at that time, which was motivated, very clearly by a racist, anti-Black ideology. In terms of now the second question was like, do I see fascists today in Congress?
Yeah, or in other parts of the U.S. bureaucracy. But in truth, because I think you've answered a lot about the U.S., there are some other questions in here that I'm eager to get to in our remaining 5 minutes, if that's fair.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Again, I'm not really into this game of naming and shaming fascists. I don't know that that's necessarily what we need to be doing. I think what I would look at if we're talking about fascism in the U.S. is the militarization of everyday life. The fact that we've seen since the end of the draft in 1973, that was a product and part of this anti-fascist, anti-militarist movement, a 700% increase in mass incarceration in the United States, 700% increase. And on the other hand, the militarization of the police who are called out to break protests against this carceral archipelago. So rather than pointing at particular individuals, I think we would have to talk about these larger social trends.
Well, so you mentioned fascists didn't threaten private property. Though fascists did expropriate the wealth of their undesirables, was that part of getting at that idea for them?
Right. Yeah, that's a great pushback on this point about them not touching private property. Of course, they touched the private property of 11 million people in Europe, through the extermination of the liquidation of those individuals and the appropriation of their assets. And so, yes, there's a historian, Dagmar Herzog, who will be reading in the class, who talks about how the Nazi racial community, they had this kind of bait and switch thing, where it was like sexual liberation and free market capitalism, as it were, for the racially pure, and a sort of collective attack on and restrictions on the non-racially pure. And so I would say that the Nazi solution, at least, was to expropriate the oppressed to fuel this global war machine. But I don't know that when we talk about attacking private property, I don't know that I would count that as an attack on the institution of private property, right? I think that that's something quite different than the sort of experiments in collectivization that you see in the Soviet bloc. Whatever you may think of them, I think it's a different type of phenomenon.
Well, so I see one final question here that I want to get to now, and apologies for the many excellent questions on here that we didn't have time to get to.
Ask me then.
A question here from Barbara Malouf is, how does a country's economic condition impact the rise of fascism? And I think it's just a particularly interesting question right now because we are in a time when the economy and politics are so interconnected in many ways. And so, we mentioned there are a number of different kind of conditions that may play a role in making a country vulnerable to or encouraging this type of ideology. So can you speak in specific to how does a country's economic condition impact the rise of fascism?
Yeah. Absolutely. We can look back at the history to help us here. So in the 20s, when fascism germinates coming out of the World War I, it takes control in Italy, and there is this spread of these grassroots fascist movements, Freikorps in Germany, many others, but you don't see another fascist regime until the 30s, right? And that obviously is because of the Great Depression, because of the massive economic downturn, not only because this sort of this crisis of capitalism makes fascism come to light for many traditional elites as a possibility to deal with these perpetual crises of capitalism, and not only because of mass immiseration. Fascism has historically been driven by lower middle class people who are afraid of falling below the lower middle class. That's a sort of sociological basis of fascism. So when there's a real threat to that lower middle class, then that's a real danger. I think the third component that is maybe not often stressed enough, that I haven't stressed enough, is that global economic crises tend to also shake up the imperialist systems that we are living under, the great powers. And in the 30s, fascists saw the Depression as the death knell of the classical imperialist order. And that's why 1931, the Japanese invasion of Manchuria is one of the first places where you see fascism spreading beyond Italy. And they present themselves as the people who will take these proletarian nations and make them great make them great among all the rest of the nations. And so that's part of the great appeal of fascism, is to respond to economic downturn through imperial activity, through colonization, either literal or financial.
Well, so I know I said that was the last question, but I am going to give you one more, David, because I think it's such an interesting question. And for that, Nils, who just asked, we will get the syllabus out, so you can see that in advance. How does social media in today's environment influence this? I mean, I imagine it comes back to this point that you made, that you can't necessarily shame the same way, because now there's another outlet that can be kind of driving this. But the power round question, which is totally unfair for a 60 to 90-second answer, just your quick thoughts on social media's impact, because it seems like a really big part of the current phenomenon.
Sure.
To think about.
I'm part of the generation that will be held responsible for that, so I ought to have an answer for that. I'll just say three things very briefly. I mean, one, you mentioned, I think it's very clear that social media changes what we mean by, the politics of shame, the politics of guilt, the politics of shame, and how masses can express themselves for good or for ill. The second thing is, well, maybe I won't try to say too many things. I guess I'll just say, when we analyze social media, we shouldn't treat it in a vacuum. It is one of many ways in which people socialize. And one of the clear things that we get from studying the history of fascism is that it's talking about the relationship between civic institutions, voluntary institutions that people socialize in, and political institutions, and the extent to which those things can be in conversation with each other. So it's not about social media in and of itself. It's about the way that social media irradiates through traditional media and through in the halls of politics, right? Social media by itself can't mean the same thing without that larger ecosystem, right? And so I think that we ought to be careful not to get stuck in a kind of technological determinism around social media, and remember that social media is what we make of it. It's what these political institutions make of it, and we have to hold on to that institutional critique, while also, of course, acknowledging the ways in which technology can alter emotional states and aggravate certain kinds of responses, spread of misinformation, et cetera. You don't need me to tell you about that. You're going to go listen to the stuff I do on NPR to tell you about that. But that's not, I would say we need to be careful in blaming, there are some scholars who I strongly disagree with who want to say fascism is about lies, and social media spreads lies. I think that's overly reductive, and I don't think it really helps us take a step forward about how we can reimagine the media landscape in a way that will strengthen our democracy, and make it more open, and by making it more open, make it less fascist.
Well, that seems like an optimistic place to end our discussion. And let me just say a huge thank you. You are sharing how this is an important piece for all of us to understand, and you are giving us that understanding. So we're very grateful to you. We're really honored for you to be part of the Graham School and teaching a class this autumn. And thank you to the more than 200 of you who joined us and actually have, stayed the entire time for this discussion. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all your questions, but I'm thrilled that we are a school where so many of you are curious and leaning into these hard questions. And the conversation is clearly to be continued. So enjoy your afternoon, everyone. And thanks again for being part of the Graham School community.
Thank you all so very much for joining. It's been really an honor and a pleasure to be able to talk with you today. And I hope to be able to see many of you in the future. And thanks especially to you, Seth, and to the Graham School for giving me this opportunity to hash this stuff out in real time, to have a discussion about a set of issues that aren't settled and that are changing every day. And I look forward to fielding some of these questions in the future.
Bye, everyone. Thanks again.